Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Barbra Stocking, President of Murray Edwards College, for those who don't know me, and it's great to have you here this evening. This is the last of the Just on the Edge lecture talks of this year. And it's great that we're doing a rather different subject than some of the ones that we've done before. And we're particularly looking, as you know, this evening about peak youth. The fact that at the moment we have 1.8 billion young people in the world, 9/10 in developing countries, and looking at both all the positives of that and all the energy that produces, but also the issues about, you know, what is there for young people in the world now that can help meet their aspirations, their desires, having seen what is really available to them in the world. So for tonight, we have with us Perry Maddox, who's the absolutely brand new Chief Executive of Restless Development, I think for about, how many weeks? 4 or 5 weeks. So, but Perry isn't new to Restless Development. He's been working for Restless Development for quite a long time and was previously its Chief Operating Officer. So he really knows all the stuff, and I know that a bit because I work with him a bit on the strategic direction for Restless Development. So we're really going to focus, and Perry, I know, will do this extremely well, on youth-led development, actually youth voice. And Restless has been extremely good in getting young people's voice into the whole set of issues and discussions, not only just about the future of work, but about the Sustainable Development Goals. Restless Development really came really to the fore beyond its work on the ground, really just before the Sustainable Development Goals were developed, because they really mobilised the youth movement around the world to actually give their views to those developing the SDGs, whether in their own country or globally at the UN, in fact. And they've now got a big programme looking at how people, also young people, really hold their own governments to account for delivering those SDGs, delivering the things that they want in their country for themselves. So it's very much youth-led, and how how youth can both take on and develop things, but also hold their leaders to account. So that's what we're about tonight. We have two great discussants, two young people from Cambridge, studying Cambridge, who will then make some comments on what Perry has said, and then we'll sit down and have a good conversation with everybody here, and we aim to finish no later than 6:30, so you can all get out there and have a nice drink. So with that, Perry, come on, let's get going with Restless Development.
Thank you, Barbara. Pleasure to be here with y'all this evening. Let me get this going. And I do have to apologize in advance for my accent, which is thoroughly unbearable. But I've worked in quite a few parts of the world, and my accent has landed squarely in the middle of the Atlantic. So if it's bothering you, just give me a little hand flash. And I kid you not, I worked for several years with our team in Uganda, really working on my enunciation. And at the end, kind of my leaving speech, I had staff come up and say, "What'd you say there?" So I'm not proud about it. So a real pleasure to be with you tonight and to talk about peak youth. And really what we'd like to do is kind of explore the intersection of youth and development. So it speaks to both kind of the developing world and the developed, but really this is about the role of young people in leading change at a critical time for our planet. So I'm going to start in 2014 and in Freetown, Sierra Leone. So I was out in 2014 in July. That was the month after the Ebola epidemic was declared by the World Health Organization in Freetown. And I was out with the purpose of meeting with a couple of our partners, which is a development euphemism for donors, right? And so we're meeting with a couple multilateral organizations and a couple kind of bilateral organizations. The biggest donors, the biggest governments of the world who are funding development in Sierra Leone, we were there to meet with, because we're already doing work with them. And what I was there to ask was, could we pause the work we're doing on peace building, on sexual health, on jobs and livelihoods, and could we redeploy the young people that were already leading that work to work on Ebola? Right? That was my ask. The answer from 3 heads of mission in Freetown was no. We don't think it's going to be that big. That was the statement, right? Now, Ebola ended up being the biggest outbreak in the history of Ebola. Massive spread and a lot of lives lost. They didn't think it would be that big, is what they told me. Well, we left those meetings, and we went and we talked to some other folks, because we had young people deployed all around the region in the southeast. So the outbreak in Sierra Leone was in the extreme southeast, in Kenema, bordered by kind of Kailaun and Pujehun, those districts. And so given that those donors weren't ready to kind of adapt, we went to the private sector and found a private sector foundation, a little less risk averse, and asked them to invest in a model for youth-led community mobilization. And we were up and away. They said yes. Now, it's really important to understand. I mean, Ebola, the first case they think was in December 2013. So it had been going for about 6 months before the country declared that kind of state of emergency. There was a lot of confusion in the early days as to what was actually happening. There had never been an outbreak of this nature in Western Africa. And so, rightfully, it was confusing. What happened in the early stages when people started to realize what it was is the messaging. And the response from the international community was to get out there and go, we need to make sure people understand Ebola is real, right? And therefore we need to communicate. And so the approach that the international community took in the first months was to train people, largely youth, put them in the back of trucks with megaphones, and to drive around with very directive messaging, Ebola is real, Ebola will kill you, right? Because this was to raise awareness. Well, the problem with that is the behavior change required to end Ebola is very complex. You're asking people not to not to touch their relatives, their loved ones who are sick. You're asking people to voluntarily go into clinics where if you've got malaria symptoms and you go in, you're likely to come out with Ebola. And you're asking people to not bury their relatives in the way that ancient traditions have said, but instead to bring in these burial teams that are dressed in literal hazmat suits. And you can think about that. Those are hard things to ask of anybody, let alone somebody living in the pressure and the fear of an outbreak of a disease that had really never hit that part of the world. The messaging from the international community was to mobilize young people to go on the back of trucks and scream, Ebola is real, Ebola is real, Ebola is real. It'll kill you. And the effect in those early months was to drive it away. It drove people back into the houses. It drove communities and made people quiet. It decreased the action that civil society was able to take to address Ebola. And that was a tough learning. What we did in the kind of pilot that a small foundation supported was to ask young people to go out to the front lines. And so we'd been working in Sierra Leone for about a decade before that. And as a result, had almost 2,000 former volunteers who had led long-term deep change in rural communities. And by long-term, I mean 12-month programs. So not drive out, drive back. 12 months embedded in the community leading change. And we asked them overnight, we said, who wants to go back out? As soon as we secured this funding, we asked who wants to go out. And overnight, we had 350 people volunteer to stop their work, to stop their lives, to say goodbye to their families, to go back out to the front line, to volunteer to fight Ebola. And I cannot tell you how terrifying the situation was. I actually looked at my calendar this afternoon to see which date I was in country. I was in country on July 14th. The first body in Freetown had showed up in July 12th. The first death in the streets. And there was a massive, just fear. Bodies were laying in streets and people weren't touching them. They didn't know what to do with them. And in this moment, 350 young people, within 24 hours, on nothing more than an SMS, said, yeah, I'm ready to go back out. And they did. And they did well. And there we started to develop, and this is not about we. Just to be really clear, this is not about Restless Development at all. This is about the power of young people. We happen to be the organization at the moment. And what they developed over those kind of next 2 months was a two-way exchange, a community triggering process that allowed communities to take the ownership to end Ebola. So not saying Ebola is real in a unilateral kind of manner, but actually encouraging communities to take the action to address their own concerns. That was a 2-month pilot. We later built that into something that we called the community-led Ebola response, right? And at this point, the donors were interested. And it went to scale. In partnership with a couple other large kind of partners in Sierra Leone, we saw 2,000 young people and paired with community leaders. So really important. This is not youth for youth. This is youth pairing with a local health worker, a traditional healer, a midwife, a birth attendant, whomever it might be, somebody trusting the communities to go out and trigger communities. And what they did is over a period of about 6 to 8 months, reached half of the communities in Sierra Leone. So massive scale. We're talking about reaching 3 million people out of 6 in Sierra Leone. And the interesting part here was the kind of the takeaway at the end of these 4 or 5 days worth of work in each community was that the communities would create an action plan that they had identified to end Ebola in their communities, right? 6 months later, we found that 98% of those action plans were still running with no external impetus, right? This is a different story about development. It's a different story about aid than you're going to see on the TV. This was led by communities. It was triggered by youth. It ended up engaging 3 million people, not as beneficiaries, not as targets, but as leaders in their own right, tapping into the agency, the capability, the leadership that lies in every single community, right? And that was the kind of the ground game, as it were. The really fun part is they had these things called DIRCs. And if you know anything about development, you know we love a terrible acronym. These were District Ebola Response Centers. And what they are is, if you think about the movies, they are that kind of military scene. So you've got this kind of command center in the 13 districts across. And in there you've got the big maps, and you've got the British military was there kind of giving the logistics and the backbone to it all. And you've got all the kind of deployment happening and the real-time reporting. In the middle of it, you've got this young person dressed in a t-shirt not dissimilar to that. And they're taking all the calls off the community call line. And what ended up happening over the course of that kind of 6 to 8 month period was they went from a nice thing to have in the room, a little kind of a soft thing that the military, basically accepted because they were told needed to be there, to being a central part of that response. Because the calls come in. Nobody calls the helpline because they don't trust it. Nobody calls the government because the government had already failed. Who they did call was the people who look just like me, who's been out there in the community, who's seen what's going on, and they're calling in there. And now you've got this young person, aged 18 to 24, sitting in a room full of kind of very senior military types, directing the surges at the end. Informing, probably not directing, that might be a little bit too grandiose. But it's a really powerful kind of lesson, right? And it didn't stop there. The work continues. The rebuilding work after Ebola is up and away. And there's been massive investment by the British government into Sierra Leone to rebuild. And what are young people doing now? They're doing something called youth-led social accountability. And it is a fancy word for empowering communities to hold their decision makers to account for the promises made. So if you said you're going to build a health center, if you said you're going to train teachers, what we're doing is equipping community members to assess whether or not that's happening, and then to hold those decision makers to account for the effectiveness of aid spend, for value for money, for impact on communities. It's not rocket science. Those of you who might know a good development, this is how we're talking about development in the 1960s. In the second part of this kind of chat, I'm going to tell you where we lost our way, because I think young people offer a solution. But that was the Ebola response. And I'll come back to it to the end, but I want to set the scene, because I think so many times when we talk about youth, it's easy to get into young people are energetic, or young people are really well connected on social media, of course, all those things, right? But the way to understand peak youth is through hardcore development outcomes. And we need to hold up that kind of mirror, because it's really, really exciting kind of potential lies. So speaking of that potential, peak youth. We don't call it a demographic dividend. We don't call it a youth bulge. We don't call it a youth time bomb, although that's what a lot of people would say. The demographic dividend is probably a fair argument. There is something out there. A lot of folks call this big youth population the demographic dividend. Why? Because it's a big youth population. There's not a big kind of pension age group above, and so there's an economic dividend to be had by a lot of job creators, income earners, not having to pay a lot of tax to support an elderly population. The problem with that is I've never once met a young person that said, hi, I'm a dividend, or hi, I'm an asset, or hi, I'd like to be commoditized, thanks. And so part of this is challenging language, and you'll hear it. Part of this is challenging language, the way we talk about young people, because the way we do right now is slightly patronizing. And so this is the challenge. We don't look out there and see a demographic dividend. We certainly don't see a time bomb, and I can't think of anything less flattering than to call somebody a bulge. What we have is the biggest youth generation in history. That's the fact. The biggest youth generation in history is alive today, right? And that's what we're talking about, peak youth. Of this generation, Barbra gave you the numbers. Half are under the age of 30. So that's 1.8 billion between 15 and 24. I'll come on to the definitions of youth, but that's your kind of standard UN definitions, 15 to 24. But most importantly, it's followed by a child boom. So in Africa right now, only about 19% of the population is 15 to 24. 41% is under 15. So when we talk about the kind of peak youth, it's over the next 15 years, half the world will be young. Over the window of the Sustainable Development Goals, half the world's going to be young at some point. Either the young people now or the big child population coming after. So this matters. This is a one-off phenomenon. And if you think about the opportunity here to kind of challenge development models, challenge the way change happens, and to radically accelerate the way change happens, it's sitting right in front of us. It's half the world. A model that works for young people to lead change, that can be scaled, is a really powerful solution. So where do they live? 90% of them live in the developing world, thus the intersection between development and youth. It's so obvious. When we talk to ministers in Uganda, they say everything we do is youth. It has to be by definition. And there's some truth in that. There is some truth in that. There's some challenges to be had there as well. But as we look at it, it's a really important time. And I don't think we're talking about it much out there in the world. It's an important time. By 2050, 1 in 3 young people will be African. The growth in peak youth is actually happening in Africa. Since 1950, the population in Asia of young people has tripled. So it's about 750 million nowadays. So big youth population in Asia, but it's already peaked. The only place where it's growing is in Africa. This is what it looks like, to give you a sense of what's happening out there in the world. This is the era of peak youth. Never before, and then kind of once we pass about 15 years from now, and never again will we see a youth population of this size. It is a one-off demographic phenomenon that has to change the way we understand our world. Now, you've probably heard about it, but most people haven't. And so it's a really interesting moment. It's a really exciting moment for anybody working in the youth space or working in development. And I think really important, these are young people ready and able to lead change in their communities right now. The young people who led that Ebola response were all Sierra Leonean. None of them were British, none of them were American. They were leading in their own communities. Look at those populations, look at the size of those populations. Think about the development challenges that are happening in Africa and Asia. They tend to be the broad populations. Solutions that mobilize this generation as protagonists, as leaders, as agents, give us a really dynamic window to change the direction of development, the direction that our world's taking. That's the power of peak youth. I'll come on to kind of what makes these youth different, but before I do that, I want to quickly indulge in a little bit of why. Why is this population here? It's broadly down to something called the demographic transition model. Now, those of you who know it will know that it's got its limitations, so don't kind of take this as canon. It was built on kind of Western economies, and it's not totally applicable in all situations. But it's a pretty decent way to understand what's happening. And what you see here is there's kind of 5 stages of an economy that this model lays out. The first stage is your extremely poor kind of areas, conflict affected, where you've got basically high birth rates and high death rates. That's the kind of starting point. In the least developed parts of the world, you tend to see very high birth rates, and you tend to see very high death rates. As economies develop, as societies kind of grow, the first thing to change is that the death rates drop. Why? Because relatively high kind of impact medicine can be had for relatively low cost early on. Think diarrhea, think infant mortality. Death rates are much quicker to drop in the early stage. After that comes the kind of decrease in birth rate. And the best variable to understand there is women's income. As women's income goes up, as women are more active in the economy, the birth rate tends to go down. So say the economists, and it's largely about incentives, but it's more societally about empowerment. And now I can make decisions about my body. Thank you very much. And so you tend to see the kind of the birth rate come down. But during that kind of gap, stage 2 and 3 is where you see a natural increase in the population. Towards stage 4, they're starting to harmonize, and then many countries now are into kind of stage 5. So think Japan, think Russia, US without immigration. These would be naturally decreasing populations, actually, where birth rate is actually below the death rate. What it gives you is these kind of population pyramids, and these are highly stylized, but you can look on the web and get a sense of population pyramids. But what they do is they kind of split down the middle, and so you get the kind of the gender breakdown, and these are all percentile. These are all kind of age windows. It's like 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, all the way up, and these reflect the population share. And so what happens here, and this is where you get the youth bulge, that's where that word's come from. It's come out of population pyramids. Through stages 2 and 3, what you get is this big youth population. To give you a sense, right now in the States, which is kind of a stage 4 economy, youth make up about 50% of the kind of elderly population, if that makes sense. Whereas in Iraq, it's 91%. You have this disproportionately large population in the middle of that kind of population pyramid, and that's what has led to peak youth. As many of the Asian economies have kind of moved into stage 3 and 4, that's why the youth generation is beginning to slow there. The African economies, by and large, aren't, or more into stage 2 and 3, and so you've got this growing population. That's what's led to this. The important part about all this, whether or not you enjoy population pyramids, or we can talk about them later if you do, this is time-bound. On the assumption that the other economies do continue to move towards stages 4 and 5, and that is a big assumption, but the assumption that they're moving in that kind of way, this is a one-off window and it will close. So what do we do with it? Well, first of all, I think we need to understand the young people that we're talking about. So let me be at pains to say this early on. Young people are not a homogenous group. I know that's obvious, but it needs saying time and time again. There is great diversity amongst this group. The politicians will look at this and understand that this is the largest voting bloc in history, if it were a bloc. The rest of us will look at it, and we need to be reminded that young people are the majority of mothers, of job seekers, of entrepreneurs, slum dwellers, refugees, you name it. Apart from old age pensioners, they are the majority of most every group in the world, right? By the very virtue of their size. But are we talking and thinking that way? Perhaps, perhaps not. The other really important thing to understand is that they are embedded and they're available now. Young people, by making up the majority of the populations, make up the majority of most communities. And that's really powerful. Young people make up the majority of most communities, whether or not it's geographically or whether or not that's kind of thematically in terms of what people might be doing or who they are. They're embedded and they're available now. By the nature, unfortunately, of unemployment, young people are much more available to take on development initiatives than older people, and children obviously less so. So those are young people today. It's a different shape, it's a different feel. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the characteristics because the current generation is very different than previous ones. But I think it's worth speaking just briefly on youth itself. Now, if any of you who have ever attended a panel or a conference or a seminar in development, especially in Asia and Africa, the first 30 minutes to 3 hours is wasted on a debate as to what is youth. It's a consistent problem in our sector. Everybody loves to talk about it. I generally walk out of the room. The UN definition of youth is 15 to 24. In most countries, practically, we're talking 15 to 30. In some countries, the definition of youth runs all the way up to 35. And I think in Nepal, it's up in the 40s. Right? So every country defines youth differently, which gets to the real actual definition of youth. It's not an age bracket, it's a transition. Youth is a transition between childhood and adulthood, between dependence and independence. And it's best understood in that light, because it's going to look different in every village, it's going to look different in every community, it's going to look different in every country. So when people tell you youth is 15 to 24, I would just suggest that you kind of swallow it and not argue with them. But the understanding here is really important of that transition. It's basically a life cycle. It's a life cycle transition. And it's the part of the life cycle that's probably the highest in potential. Now, in terms of cold, hard outcomes, we know early investment in youth, early investment in children, means that you have less cost over time. You invest early into education, you'll see that yield over time. Young people tend to fit the same kind of bill. So, investing in youth livelihoods will pay off over time. So it's a nice upside in terms of life cycle. But the flip side is also the individual is more disposed to lead change, more disposed to take action. Now, not all young people, but by and large, young people tend to be a little bit more progressive, a little bit more open-minded, a little bit happier to change. That's youth. It's not an age bracket. It's a transition. It's a transition full of potential. So what does it look like for young people today? Now, we're going to have some fantastic rebuttals, and please do tell me this is not how it looks. These are generalizations, and I will continue to apologize for that because I do not claim to speak on behalf of 3.5 billion people under 30. But the interesting thing to understand here is that young people look a little bit different. And that second bullet might surprise you. Young people, by and large, are more civically active, they're better educated, and they're doing less reckless things than the generations before them. If we think back to the kind of the baby boomers, the kind of hippie generations, even the groups, the Gen X, far less consumption of drugs and alcohol, far more active civically. And I don't think we hear this enough. We hear the millennials and we go, oh, they're snowflakes and all this kind of stuff. It's unfair. People are making a ton of money on kind of characterizing millennials. There's always been that issue in the workplace. It used to be Gen X that we were worried about in the workplace. Now we're worried about millennials. There will be another one, and they'll get some sort of horrible label. The point here is this is a very different generation. They have unprecedented access to information, and they're better connected than my generation. I'm technically a millennial. I'm on the cusp, but don't feel like one so much these days. And that's different. They're participating more, but in very different ways. And this is important. 13% of young people surveyed a couple of years ago thought that joining a political party is an effective way to achieve political ends. Young people are, by and large, taking political action, but they're rejecting political parties. They don't tend to see voting as the core act of citizenship. I'll come on to that in a second. Instead, they're organizing in different ways. Fluid movements, networks, translocal activism. And I think that's really important. There's a lot of positive in here. We'll come on to the challenges. What do these leaders look like? There's a good report out there from an organization called RISE, R-H-I-Z-E. And they did a nice piece of work out there in terms of what type of leaders are these? And these are the kind of what they learned. First of all, young people are what they call actualizing citizens, as opposed to kind of dutiful citizens. And this is a generation break. And the big difference here is that young people, these actualizing citizens, they join movements that speak to identity, they join movements that speak to values. They tend to less understand citizenship as a definition of who I am, it's less noun, more verb, basically. Citizenship is an expression of action. Citizenship is an expression of kind of my engagement in society. It's a way to assert my rights, not necessarily a way to join an established system. So you actually, we always hear the cries, young people aren't voting enough. Now is that a condemnation of young people? Actually, I think it's a condemnation of the politicians running. And young people are saying, actually, I don't think I'm going to get a result out of that. Not to say young people don't vote, but it's a different kind of generation. And the way it understands change is in this kind of actualizing way, as opposed to doing my duty as a citizen, which has been kind of, the last 100 years, the way we've understood citizenship. The core action is voting, therefore you probably tend to join a political party, et cetera. Whereas young people, as I said, are organizing community, networked, and interestingly, translocal actions. So it's a very fancy and probably unnecessary word for connecting the personal, the local, the community, all the way up to the kind of the global journey of action. And we see that every day. And a lot of that's been tech-enabled, but it's not limited to the tech space. And so you've got these kind of different leaders who lead in a different way. Youth leadership is described as broadly as participatory, as community-driven, grassroots, intersectional. That's a word we didn't even hear 10 years ago in the public discourse. It's generally young people who are talking about intersectionality these days. And that's really important. It's much more nuanced. It's not, here's your voter card, you're a citizen. It is, I am mobilizing around the ideas and the issues that matter to me. And oftentimes that's going to kind of transcend location. There's a great deal of power in that. To give you a sense, meet Primrose. Prim is 30 years old. She started a campaign called Youth Power, 2 or 3 years ago? As a young person in Zimbabwe. That campaign now has 200 youth-led organizations and 45 odd countries around the world, not just signed up to a campaign. This is not kind of a click a box, collectivism. These are 200 organizations doing hardcore accountability work on the SDGs at community level, at national level. They're collecting their own data. They're taking that data and using it to hold decision makers to account about these promises. That's one person. She was 27 when she started it. This is translocal activism. This is what citizenship looks like nowadays. And it's exciting because there's tons of power in it. It means that we're not limited to the traditional channels of power. It doesn't necessarily, this engages politicians. The target here is government. And it's not aggressive. It's in partnership with government. So it's not to say young people aren't acting with government in traditional structures. They're just not organizing themselves, by and large, in that way. It's really exciting. This is a different generation. And in that generation, I hope you see the opportunity. Because really what we're talking about here is we've got a one-off demographic phenomenon. Apart from women, who make up a little more than 50% of the population, we don't have any population out there like that gives us the potential for scale. Right? Youth-led solutions that are scalable can change the world. The nature of youth is really important. So you've got the demographics, but it's a lot more than demographics. The nature of young people, currently, is different. It's different than the kind of, it's not a paradigm shift, but it's a pretty significant shock to the system. Young people are organizing, taking action in a different way that offers a tremendous kind of potential. And it aligns to this critical window for global development. Whether or not you think this is on jobs, and I'll come on to the numbers soon, or about climate and the race to make sure that we don't heat up the planet, or if you think it's about migration, or you think it's about radicalization, pick your issue of the day. They are all very urgent, and we've got a solution staring us in the face. That's youth. That's peak youth. It's really easy for me to say that. I'm the chief executive of a youth-led organization, and we're very passionate about it. We have trouble a lot of times convincing people to run with it, though, and this is why. Because when you step back and look at international development, I think we're at a bit of a crossroads as a sector, and we're failing to tap into this opportunity. To give you a sense of why, let me tell you about a study that came out a couple of years ago in Tanzania. I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. And out comes this study. It's that 2% of unemployed young Tanzanians are committing crime, right? Cue the outrage, the media outrage, the government. We all got to react to it. The NGOs got on board as well. Everybody's worried about these 2% of young Tanzanians who are committing crime, 2% of unemployed young Tanzanians who are committing crime. Now, at the time, about a half million young Tanzanians were entering the job market every year. So 500,000 young people coming onto the job market to find 100,000 jobs. 2% of young Tanzanians are committing crimes as a development industry. So wait. Flip it on its head. You're saying 98% of 400,000 young people are not? They're finding a way. They're hustling. They're surviving. They're building on, building local leadership around their own agency. What if we flip it on its head and understand that question? That's not a question that our development, unfortunately, is ready to answer just yet. And this is why. That's what I said young people are today. But if you look at kind of how young people tend to be, and this is a broad generalization, we'll come on to it, tend to be seen in the field of development, they tend to be talked about as beneficiaries to be reached, problems to be solved, targets to be counted. Now that sounds a little bit heavy-handed, I promise you it's not. I'll show you the next call for proposals from you name the donor. I'll show you the next kind of government strategy. They're talking about how many young people can we reach, how many jobs can we create for those young people, and how many kind of migrants can we mitigate from getting on the boats, how many young people can keep from getting radicalized. It is a very negative definition. Young people at the best tend to be seen as recipients, on occasion as participants, and very rarely as leaders in development. Here's why it matters. Over the next decade, that is actually 1 billion, if you count the little people. Over the next decade, 1 billion young people are going to enter the job market. 400,000 are going to find jobs globally. Not 400,000, 400 million are going to find jobs, which means 600 million young people are not going to find jobs over the next decade. Say it again, 600 million. I had a conversation with Barbra the other day. She said, I think after climate change, this is the biggest issue facing the world. I tend to agree. 600 million. Now, why are we not working to those 600 million, right? Here's the challenge. If lower income countries grow at 5%, which is a pretty good clip of growth for an economy, it will take 332 years for them to have the job markets the size of a more developed economy. So if we grow at a good clip, it'll take us 3 centuries to create the kind of jobs to absorb this population. Think about it. Now, when you look at the policymakers, what are they saying? Formal job sector, formal job sector, formal job sector. The World Bank has just launched this new initiative. In it, they say 600 million, they're coming onto the market, we know, and the solution is job creation, formal training, skills. That's what we've been talking about for 30 years. The people who are making the decisions in development, it's not just World Bank, it's governments, everybody, bluntly don't know what to do with the 600 million. And so they're blindly going down the same routes of kind of top-down macro growth and expecting that to create the jobs. It simply won't happen quick enough. It simply won't happen quick enough. So why are we missing this? If development's out there to understand how to lead change, why are we missing it? Well, here's a hint. A couple of years ago, DevX, and DevX is a kind of a leading kind of business-to-business exchange of development professionals. It's out of the US, but it's of good size. Ran a survey amongst its membership of what they thought the development workers of the future would look like. And it was, I think, probably meant to be a nice light touch kind of piece to give a flavor of where development, sector professionals might be heading. But it was actually quite damning of the sector itself. What it said was, first of all, 79% of respondents said a graduate degree will be needed to be a development worker of the future. Bang, you've just ruled out 95% of the world. probably more than 95%. Right there, on the assumption that you have to have a master's to come work in development. Do you think those young people in Sierra Leone, I don't know, I'm sure a couple of them had a master's, but not many. That kind of bias is a problem. 57% said that over the next decades, international expats will kind of decrease in importance in favor of local-led change, which disturbingly means 43% of development professionals did not think that locally led change is going to grow over the next couple of decades. It's sickening that. 72% said multilingual professionals will be the norm, right? But then later on in that report, they wrote about data-driven, evidence-based programming, multidisciplinary approaches, impact evaluations, new methods of development financing. So fluid in what? Jargon. And this happens in all fields. And I am a development professional. I have a master's. I am guilty of this stuff on every day. So it's not kind of soapbox moment. But it is a challenge to our sector. Because when you look at it, in the data of the respondents, 65% had been in the field for more than 10 years. 62% were male. And strange for a global survey, country of origin wasn't noted, which tells me that it probably are the US and the UK. And so what do we have here? We have a development field that looks into the future and sees itself. It's not me looking and saying, my replacement is Primrose. It's me looking in the future and saying, you probably need another guy with a master's, thanks. This is why the talent of youth and the talent of communities is being sidelined to development. It's a real problem, but it's a massive opportunity. It doesn't take much to change. More broadly, development's at a crossroads. You don't need me to tell you this, I don't think. The scandals around safeguarding of the last couple of months have been notable, but I don't think it's really about safeguarding is a manifestation of a different issue here. We've heard it, in a call for aid too, not just Me Too, but aid too. What if we overhaul aid too? In the last couple of months, we've seen some really good challenges, I think, into the sector about race and why is development so white, bluntly. Why is the leadership of development organizations so white when so many of the people leading development are not? And why are Africans and Asians and Latin Americans not getting into these senior leadership roles? It's a good question. Why is it so male? I don't know if any of you follow, but there's a really nice debate in the development sector recently under the hashtag Sausage Fest, because one of the leading thinkers here in the UK had written a blog about the best development kind of people to read. And somebody correctly called him out and said, almost every one of those authors is male, thanks. Really important debate, right? You've heard it recently, there's some calls to end this word beneficiary. Beneficiary is the word that tends to be used by the sector for the people who receive the program, right? But the whole point here is if you treat people as passive beneficiaries, you're overlooking their entire agency. That's a problem. Comic Relief has said recently, last 2 weeks, they're going to end the white savior videos. Fantastic. It's a couple decades late. But it's the right kind of thing. And ultimately what's being challenged here, I think, is power. It's not that anybody in development that I know that has any kind of credibility thinks there's anything wrong with community or grassroots-led change. Most people don't feel that. Some of your economists might argue that it's all about kind of macro growth and fair play. But most people who are developmentalists tend to believe in the power of grassroots-led change. The reason we don't invest in this is because it's hard to scale. And so what's happened under pressure to deliver bigger numbers over the last 30 years, many of the organizations that lead development have been built for scale and ultimately to attract the funding to enable that scale. And so you get these kind of vertical organizations that deliver amazing scale. And there's nothing wrong with what's being delivered there. But at some point, sometimes the trade-off in power has been too heavy. And so you end up creating a power dynamic whereby the people who are receiving your work don't feel empowered to demand that you treat them correctly. And so development's at a little bit of crossroads. I mean, interestingly, compared to 30 years ago where civil society organizations and the international NGOs were seen as kind of bucking the trend, challenging the status quo, most young people nowadays see NGOs as the system themselves, right? And that's a real kind of change, and it's a challenge to us. Within our field, there's a massive tension between kind of the activists and the professionals. And Rose, who's our UK director, is smiling because we have it in Restless Development too. Our kind of folks who are out in the street are often going, Perry, why are you worrying about DFID? Why are you wearing a suit? Come on, man. And too right. There is that tension in all of us. And the bigger you get, the harder that tension becomes. Because you do need professionals to run these organizations. We have to report to government. It's not a bad thing that that we're held to account. That's a very good thing. But it becomes increasingly technocratic sometimes. We've just won a big grant from DFID. And I just received the startup papers on the train up. It's like 60 pages of detailed due diligence that we're going to have to work through. Now, we can just about handle that. Can smaller organizations? No way. Getting a grant from USAID is sometimes the poison chalice. I've seen many small organizations go out of business because they can't meet the monitoring and the reporting requirements. This is a challenge for development. But there's solutions too. Forgive me for this pretty rough looking graph. I made it myself on Word. It shows. This is the grant that we just won from DFID. And it's not Restless Development. It's a 10-party consortium of kind of next generation, I think, civil society organizations. And they asked us on a call for this was a call for civil society effectiveness. So how do you increase the effectiveness of civil society? And to date, the answer has been train the northern NGOs, who train the southern NGOs, who train the grassroots organizations. Kind of a cascading flow tends to be the way. Well, that's a nice way of saying top down, right? Trickle down, which we know doesn't tend to work. What we've said is you're never going to have an effective civil society if you do three things. If you overlook the agency, the leadership, and the capability of all people. And I guess that's just a values-based statement. People born into poor communities versus people born into rich communities, it is simply a fact of luck. Where are you born, right? They have the same amount of leadership, the same amount of agency, the same amount of ability, and they know a whole lot more about what's going on in their communities than I do. Now, I've been benefited. I'm a white male American, which puts me into the most privileged kind of group in the world. I'm painfully aware of that. And so I get an education, I can do this kind of stuff. The challenge here is that when we treat people as beneficiaries, we overlook their agency, and we tend to instinctively, therefore, run at as opposed to be led with or by. The second is about power, and it's about power handing over to southern-based civil society. So organizations in the global south, and I'll come on to some numbers here, struggle. They're often at the tail end of what I would call a capacity building problem. So there's a lot of capacity building of southern-based actors. And so what we do is we sit down and we train this organization, this great organization in Kenya. Somebody wants us to capacity build. It tends to take the shape of capacity building to be a sub-grantee, to report back to the USAID, to report back to the UN on those big, heavy bureaucratic requirements. So we're not really building the leadership, the agency, and the ability of those organizations to lead strategically over time. We're training them to run this program for us for the next 3 months. And along the way, we're taking the overheads at each stage. So they're doing all the delivery and they're receiving none of the overheads, which means that they're not able to grow institutionally, which means they don't stand on their two legs. That's a problem, and that's got to change in development. And the third is we're not accountable. Accountability right now, transparency in development, tends to take the form of a one-way post hoc flow. So after the program's done, here's the evaluation. Here's our published accounts. Some people publish their minutes online at the boards, but it's all kind of one-way NGO development actor out to beneficiaries, right? And what this ends up doing is basically excluding all the agency out there. And it leads to the failure that we see to build the resilience of those organizations, of those individuals, of those communities to tackle big problems. But it also leads to the challenges that we rightfully have as a sector. Whether or not wherever you fall on the development spectrum, whether or not you think aid is good or aid is bad, the lack of transparency and the lack of handing over and candor in development, I think is a big part of the reason that trust in aid is decreasing. I don't believe that the British public is stupid and can't understand nuanced arguments about why aid matters. I think we've probably dumbed it down too much, and we haven't been brave enough to say, actually, this is being led by those young people. So what does it mean in practice? A study of NGOs found that only about less than a quarter of international, these are the big actors. Sorry, I didn't explain NGOs. Non-governmental organizations. So these are your kind of, your household kind of charity names. Restless Development is an INGO. That's technically what we classified as. We don't see ourselves that way, but that's what we would. Only a quarter engage young people as leaders and partners in development. The rest engage young people as assets, as recipients, or not at all. These are the people delivering development out there, and they're the best ones. Because when you come onto the private sector delivery, it's even lower. When you come onto government-led delivery, it's even lower. The NGOs are the cream of the crop in terms of engagement, right? And only 20% are really tapping into the agency of youth. And the reason is there's a big catch-22 out there. Development funders don't want to fund things that aren't proven. But youth being a new field has a weaker evidence base than agriculture, than economies, economic development, than water sanitation, et cetera. And so there's a real kind of catch-22 for youth-led change. There isn't a huge, robust kind of academic base out there. There's plenty of evidence. And it's hard to attract the investment to do that. The third one's most important here. Almost no money is spent in development at the grassroots level. It's being spent by government, it's being spent by multilateral UN agencies, it's being spent by NGOs. Grassroots organizations receive a trickle of that amount. And that's why half of the youth organizations that we talked to 2 years ago, so they'd be out of business within a year. What are the outcomes? The outcomes that young people continue to be disproportionately affected by poverty. The number 2 killer of young people last year was HIV, globally. We've forgotten about HIV, many of us. And young people tend to be disproportionately excluded from decision making. It's not surprising. So that's the challenge, right? And I'm not going to beat up development. I believe in it for what it's worth. I believe we need to do it better. And here comes the opportunity, right? Of peak youth. Put that opportunity of peak youth with the problem of development. And we have a chance to flip it on its head and to radically shift the way change happens in the world. If you don't believe me, believe Ava. This is Ava. She's from a rural community in upcountry in Tanzania. And a couple of years ago, she's 17 now, so not so old, but a couple of years ago when she was 15, she wrote a letter to her local government. And what she said was, me and the girls in my community are spending 2 to 3 hours a day walking to get water from the water point and therefore missing education. And for those of you who know much about this part of the world, you also know that there are very high rates of gender-based violence around water points because the girls are always the ones going, and it's high risk, these journeys. It's nasty stuff, right? And she wrote her community, and she wrote her local kind of council and said, can we get a water point in the school to keep me in school? Pretty obvious request, pretty good one. No answer. So she wrote a letter to President Obama, and he got an answer. She got an answer. And in the last 5 minutes of the UN Assembly, I want to say 2015, I could be wrong there, he stood up, classic Obama, he picks up the kind of a thing and he goes, Ava, we see you, we hear you, and we commit to people like you, right? So cool, goosebumps moment for everybody. We felt good about that. She didn't stop. She started a global petition. Think about this translocal thing. This is rural Tanzania. This is very rural. She created an online petition that got 150,000 signatures from around the world. She walked it in not just to that local council, she walked it into the president of Tanzania. And then about a year later, the well got built, right? This is the power of young people. There are 3.5 billion out there who are going to be like Ava. She's changing development. Normally, the story would be, poor girl in the village didn't have water, NGO came in, built it, happy picture, right? That's not the story. And that's where we can really change. So how do we do it? I won't labor these kind of models, because I want to get onto the 2 people who know a lot more about this than me. There are models out there for how you engage young people. These are some of the most basic ones. But this one in the top left came from a World Bank Development Report in 2007. And this was probably one of the more seminal moments where the development community woke up to the potential of youth. World Bank finally said this matters, and then everybody kind of took the cue from there. Now, I won't tell you about the discussion. I will tell you about the discussions behind that, because we were in those. And you know what one of the senior directors of the World Bank said to us? No such thing as this youth sector you talk about. It doesn't exist. I said, what do you mean? I mean, we worked with 446 youth-led organizations last quarter. It definitely exists. They said, it's not investable. I can't invest in it. If I want to invest in women, I know where I invest. If I invest in agriculture, I know where to invest. If I want to invest in landmine removal, I know where I invest. If I can't invest in the youth sector, it doesn't exist. That was a challenge we had 10, 15 years ago. It's not quite there. People now recognize this phenomenon of youth. But they're still broadly stuck in that kind of yellow lens of treating young people as beneficiaries. Problems, outcomes to be created, right? As opposed to as partners or as opposed to leaders. This column here on the right is Roger Hart's ladder of youth engagement. I think it's from the early 90s, his version. And it's really interesting. You know, it's kind of, how do you push? And this is what we talk about with decision makers. What level of youth engagement do you have? And we challenge them to kind of push that up the level. No, it's not to say all things need to be kind of 8-level, 8th rung kind of engagement. In some places, you'll need to do stuff on behalf of young people, and that's okay if you're explicit and you agree that. You know, I had a meeting the other day with a minister in Denmark. They would not have given that meeting to young people unfairly. But once we get in there, we kind of wedge the door open, and then in comes the flow, right? It's okay to act on behalf of young people if you're doing it explicitly and you ask permission. Thank you very much, right? There are ways to kind of move this up. This bottom left is how Restless works, and it's built on the beneficiary kind of partner lens. In the bottom left, this was a piece of work we did for Comic Relief, actually. They wanted to create a youth leadership strategy a couple of years ago. They hired us to do a bit of research, and what we found is there was kind of 5 prevailing modalities for how you engage young people in change, all the way from training young people as leaders. which is the old school way. You want to build youth leadership, train them as leaders, right? It's somewhat successful, right? But it's pretty cost intensive and it's actually not terribly active, right? The second is youth partnerships, where basically young people are delivering your strategy. So this is your kind of your peer education models, your youth extension models. It might be the NGOs, the government's model, but young people are at least delivering it, right? That's a step up. The third is kind of youth-led change, right? And this is where young people are organizing their own organizations, be them formal NGOs or fluid movements, and that the role of kind of traditional decision makers and development actors is to support and to engage, right? Now you're talking about partnership and leadership. The fourth is youth voice. Now this is where it gets exciting. This is young people shaping decision making and holding decision makers to account. So youth-led social accountability, youth-led research, youth-led advocacy. These voices are often way more relevant and have more salient insight to add to a policy process than somebody sitting in Kampala or somebody sitting in Johannesburg or somebody sitting in Delhi programming out, right? So how do you bring youth voices in? Because you can't expect decision makers to know, unless, at the very best, they might be experts on youth, but more likely, you're asking somebody to do something that's very difficult. So how do you bring the youth voices into the room to shape that? And the highest level of engagement is youth governance, which is when the young people are holding the organizations to account, holding the development bodies to account. So for example, at Restless Development, we don't have a youth advisory board. We have young people on the board. We have two of my bosses are 19 years old. And that's really exciting. My board chair is 35, so even still, pretty young for this kind of field. And how do you empower young people to own the whole process? What we found when we did this for Comic Relief is obviously the higher impact stuff is this way, toward the voice and governance, and then the frequency of programming is out to the right. And we told them, you've got a space in the middle here. That's a USP, go for it. And they built their model, and it's working for them. So there's ways to do this, and I won't belabor this because if you're interested, let me know afterwards, and we can send you a pile of information on how you do this. We were at Chogom last week, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and Primrose actually grabbed Boris Johnson without knowing who he was, and pulled him over and worked through the kind of the 15-point plan we have for how young people can be included in decision making. To his credit, he listened to it all. We'll see what happens. But there are plenty of ways to kind of shape and share. There is appetite in the development field right now for youth solutions. This is the exciting part. 15 years ago, the fight for us was to get young people into the room. That's not the case anymore. The fight for us to make sure that the engagement is meaningful now. And that's a foothold that we've got. And that's the opportunity. So how then? If I beat up development too much, how do we fix it? It's a couple simple messages for you. First of all, we need to have the courage to hand power back to the communities. There is a role for development actors, for sure. There's a role. I mean, last week, so when we met the minister, she said, I want to invest in the youth sector, but I can't. And the reason she can't is because she's accountable to taxpayers, and she needs to be able to invest in organizations that have audit trails that are independently verifiable, that can have quality, that can show delivery. Fair enough. She's not going to be able to change that government mechanism. How do we do this in a candid way to share power back? How does somebody like a Restless Development act as a broker for those organizations and say, we'll take the due diligence burden. Thank you very much. I'll handle that 60-page document so that young people can lead, so that communities can lead. That's the kind of message. And it doesn't have to be an INGO. The business of development is working yourself out of business. The whole point is that we don't want to hang around. So how do we courageously hand back power to communities? How do we not tolerate victimization of people living in poverty? Have a trip on the tube. I'm sure by the time we get back to London tonight, get on the tube, you'll see it. You'll see it. Now sometimes emergency appeals are needed to gather action, and I'm not saying don't do that. But how often do you see young people or communities portrayed as protagonists, as leaders, as agents of change in the kind of the ads that come across the TV screen asking for money? That's because it doesn't tend to raise money. But there's something in this, How do we tap into that agency? Because you flip the whole thing on its head. How do you understand the 600 million and go, how are you making it by? Because when you do ask the 600 million, guess what they tell you? Multiple sources of income. I don't have a CV. I don't go get a job for life. Most young people in Africa have 4 or 5 sources of income. It's working at mom's shop. It's working at dad's business. It's a little bit of entrepreneur on the side. It's a little bit of hustle. You name it. Young people are getting by. But if we treat them as victims, we never ask the question. If you ask the question, based on your expertise, what does the Tanzanian government actually need to be doing with its livelihoods programming? Now you're starting to get some really interesting stuff. And that can shape policy. And that can shape funding flows. And that can help a government to solve a big problem. Simply by asking and simply by listening. It's so funny, people do this with us all the time. They say, Restless, oh, it's so cool. Because you listen to young people, and I'm sometimes taken aback by that. There's nothing cool about that. If we're working on behalf of somebody, we should definitely be driven by them. That's basic stuff. And then finally, how do we build partnerships and all this? accountable partnerships, candor, invite people in. One of the healthiest things that's going to come out of this safeguarding scandal, I hope, is that NGOs open themselves up a little bit more and talk a little bit more about the challenges and a little bit more about the reasons that we do have trouble. Because everybody has trouble. If you get big enough, you're going to have safety incidents. If you get big enough, you're going to have theft. You're going to have fraud. You know, it happens in every business in the world. It happens in every NGO in the world. If you get to be big enough, these things happen. If we act like they don't happen, we're not really having a candid conversation, and people will lose trust in us. So what about you? Here's the call to action. We don't want to check. What we want to ask you to do is think about how do you direct your voice, your spending, your ideas, your conversations. When I talked about that kind of translocal activism, one of the main things that we hear from young people is, you know, it's not just organizing my movements, it's how I spend my money. How do I consume? And how does that change? You know, the people in this room have a lot of power. Whether or not you like it or not, you have a lot of power by the very virtue of where you're sitting, where you're born, and the educational status that you attained. If you're giving to charities, ask them these questions. It doesn't have to be about young people. Ask them the questions. How are you engaging communities? What's your strategy for youth? Do you treat young people as partners or do you treat them as beneficiaries? I'd like to talk to you about that. That's a good question. It keeps people on their toes. Do the same with your politicians. We support 0.7. Fantastic. Let's go a little bit better than that. It's not just about the quantity of aid spent that we put out there, it's about the quality. So therefore, you know, minister, what does that mean? Therefore, member of parliament, how are you engaging? How do you understand youth? And if you don't, can we talk about it, right? But it's also in our language. Watch out if you ever find yourself saying young people are the leaders of tomorrow. Watch out. We've all said it, right? They have to be the leaders today. Look at those numbers. The agency and the leadership is there. Watch out if you kind of passively accept the victimization, the portrayals of young people that are often seen in the news and the media, right? A tiny minority of young people are radicalized. A tiny minority migrate. An even smaller minority are engaged in knife crime in London. Yet if you were to look at the media and not challenge it, you might think it's a whole lot more. So there's plenty we can do. To wrap up, let's go back to Ebola. I'm sorry, I have run a little long. The most important part of this story, right? 2,000 young mobilizers reaching half a country, triggering half a country to end the biggest development crisis that it had in a decade, and they did, and it's proven. We have one of the biggest data sets of how behavior change influences kind of epidemiological, I can never say that word, outbreaks. It's being studied by Gates now. They've commissioned a 3-year PhD to take these 50,000 data points from across Sierra Leone and look at how this changes. And one of our former staff is now working with the World Health Organization to embed that into the situation reports, so the SIT reports, the guide decision making in all those kind of military centers, and to the community engagement protocol. Scalable models can change the way development works. That's what we asked DFID to fund with that kind of little diagram I showed you. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to build scalable models, and we're going to give them away to the people who deliver at scale, right? This is powerful. It wasn't just a small case. You know, these are 5,000 people lost their lives in this outbreak. It was ended by treatment and care and all the stuff that you've seen in the hospitals on the TV, but it was really ended by communities themselves. And the powerful point about this, about peak youth, is that not a single person got on a plane in this story. These were Sierra Leoneans. These were young Sierra Leoneans. There wasn't an American, there wasn't a Brit. We had one Australian in that office of 150 people. He happened to be there beforehand. These were Sierra Leoneans leading a response. In Nepal, after the earthquakes, you know who built the most temporary learning centers? So all the schools were devastated in the earthquake areas. And if you think about the psychosocial trauma to young people and to children, you know, houses being collapsed, not having where safe to go, not being able to go to school is a really big deal. And going to school is a pretty curative kind of thing. The biggest builders of schools was the government of Nepal. Right after them was young people. Young people built 500 youth-led organizations. I'm not even talking about Restless here. 40 youth-led organizations across Nepal built 500 temporary learning centers within a year to get children back into school. The biggest NGOs were in the 300 to 400 range. Young people, young Nepalis. Again, no one got on a plane there. There is a tremendous agency out there. Parkland, in Florida right now. Finally, we're having a meaningful discussion about, you know, guns in the States. Those are young people with authentic voices, legitimacy coming out of their communities raising that issue. There's power, there's agency, and there's leadership in every community in the world. This is not youth for youth. This is young people tapping into that power. And so that is peak youth.
Great, Perry. That's a passionate account of young people, what young people can do, young people's voice and all the rest of it. We're going to have two young people now make some comments about that and see what they think about all of that. The two of them are, first of all, Alia Khalid, who is a Gates scholar from Pakistan, and she's working on her PhD in education attached to Leone. And her central part of her work is about access to learning really of the female population in Pakistan. But I think looking particularly at mother's agency in all of this. So the word agency appeals as well. But she's not going to speak about that. She's going to comment on Perry. The second person is Alice Musabendi, who is from Rwanda but has lived a number of years in Canada. And she's at Murray Edwards, and she's doing a PhD in politics and international studies, and she's working on peace building in the Great Lakes in Africa, like Congo, Rwanda, and so on, looking at peace building in post-conflict situations. So two very interesting people, very different subjects and backgrounds. So Ali is going to come and start, and then Alice will follow.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Perry, for sharing your experiences. I was about to say with the youth dividend, but I'll change my terminology, the peak youth. And my own doctoral research at the Department of Education is about women's agency, like Barbara said, and the influence as mothers and their influence on their daughters' education in Pakistan. So just a little bit of background, because most of my comments, I'm sorry, Barbara, will be from the perspective of education and inclusion as such. So from Perry's discussion, the one critical question that comes forward is, how do we bring the agency back to the grassroots? I think that is the kind of question that the field of education is also grappling with. As you highlighted, the process of giving the reins of development to the youth population is a bit complicated, as we saw in the Ebola outbreak, the first reaction, and then how it turned out to be. Education is often understood. Similarly, you see a similar situation with education, which is usually understood as, you know, something that will bring economic gains, and in terms of increase in per capita income. But usually the non-tangible, the intangible aspects of learning, like political empowerment, are usually left out. These critical questions are even more important in terms of girls' education. So I'm going to speak a little bit about girls' education because that is my focus, because girls in many parts of the world hardly ever make it to schools. So how can they then become agents and active participants in their societies? If you look at the situation in Pakistan, it has almost the 6th biggest population bulk right now in the world, and 27% of these people are young. So this is usually referred to as, I'm sorry, the youth bulge. But if we put gender into the mix, the situation becomes even more complicated, because girls are less likely to ever have access to schools in most of the parts of the country and participate in the labor market. So what is the future of these girls who, by default, are born in a situation where the pathways to their transition to adulthood are already very much constrained? How do we bring the voices of these girls to the fore and, you know, bring them to the decision makers and the policy makers in their own governments? For my PhD, I interviewed 30 women from rural parts of Pakistan, and almost the average age of marriage of these mothers was 19 years. The politically aware mothers and their potential of influencing their own lives and the lives of their children was very hard to miss. So they had that particular language and the knowledge with which they could claim their rights for themselves and for their children. For example, these women were able to closely observe how the government, or what role the government was playing in the education sector, and at the same time, they were able to hold the schools to account for the kind of and the type of the quality of education that they were giving to their children. This, but the main question is that how did this come about? This, in my opinion, is the biggest challenge that the development sector faces today. The challenge of giving people the language and the skills with which they can claim their justified positions in their own societies. And I think with respect to what also Perry insisted on, I think the people, when in claiming their agencies back, the strategies that they develop, the development sector can actually learn from these strategies to maybe think of alternative models of youth engagement. Thank you so much. I'll call Alice forward now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Perry. It was very, very interesting and enlightening to listen to you. I am, however, going to disagree on many things, just so you know. I'll try to do it nicely. One of my, in my own research, which has now slightly changed, PhDs do that sometimes. At the moment, I look at ideas of collective identity in African states and how states sort of collaborate to advance then, peace and security and matters of security on the continent and how these are dealt with in the African Union. And funny enough, last year, the African Union had decided to dedicate a name last year, 2017, the Year of the Youth, where all of the member states, 54 of them, had come together to tackle these issues. What do we do with them? So I have to agree with you on this point that there are 2 or 3 views of who the youth are. There are either problems that need to be tackled, obviously, because crimes and unemployment are issues that need to be dealt with in that way. Or they are beneficiaries, as you say, so they see them as receiving different policy outcomes. What I saw, though, in development industry is a new sort of hybrid way of viewing them as potential. They have potential. Look at the power of the youth. It does sound really good, but it's incredibly unfair. In the sense that if you think about it, in the West, young people have a chance between the age of 14 and the age of 21 to go to school, go to high school, and start university, finish the first year, the first part of university, and then be called an adult to go out and work. In the developing world, by using this language, I would argue, of seeing them either beneficiaries or even as potential, we're robbing them the chance. Because in psychology, researchers would say that between the age of 14 and the age of 23, you're not just having transition. The neurons and all sorts of things are coming together. You are becoming a person. But by putting all of these heavy expectations at these young people who, some of them live in countries coming out of wars, some of them live in extreme poverty, putting the weight of change on their heads is something I find extremely demanding, mostly because I was one of those people. At the end of the Rwandan genocide, I was 14. Now, at age 38, I realize how much of my life got lost in the 10, 15 years that followed the war, because you have the weight of your country, you have the weight of your own problems as an individual, and everything is on you. And the development industries love these sort of personalized stories of, look at, so-and-so, she's doing quite well, and she started this organization. And I'm thinking, where is her government? The government should be coming up with these ideas instead of putting that on top of somebody who is 17 who should be reading books and doing Shakespeare plays. not solving the entire problems of the world. So that's where I disagree both with the industry and the aid industry and with what the governments are trying to do. But perhaps I am romanticizing things. The second point I wanted to make, and it's something that I also struggle a lot about, mostly because as a feminist scholar, I have an issue with seeing youth as if it was one big group, because within this group, especially women and young women, are quite disadvantaged. We have seen, for example, in the last 20 or so years, most of the women, the young women who try, for example, to immigrate as part of these big waves of people mostly from closer to North Africa to go into Europe, they suffer most, they lose more, they die more. And so these issues somehow, when we speak of the youth as a group, a homogeneous group, if you wish, we forget these extremely difficult groups of people classes of people, especially young women, who have much more to lose, whether they participate or don't participate. In some countries, for example, you have women don't have the youth. There is no, you are a child, then you're a young woman, then you're marriable. You know, whether you're 15 or you're 25, it somehow doesn't matter. So seeing that as I go look at these young women, I feel like there is something we are missing. I feel like there is a discussion here we should be having about how to see this agency, yes, of the youth as a global movement, but also to see it as a very, very critical time for young women to figure out what it is that they're trying to deal with. And we need to be able to include this in whatever discussions that we are going to have about the youth. The last point I want to make, I'm going to be more like those academic people who say all sorts of things. So at the start of your conversation, you mentioned something about how people go to these conferences and people say, well, what is the youth? In and of itself, it does sound like a useless discussion. We all know the youth. But although Barbra said I was the youth and I was very, very excited about it. But what I want to say is it's important that we figure out a way to define it approximately because it has huge implications. For example, if we cannot decide who the youth are, then we end up with policies like we have young people who are allowed to go in the army or be recruited in the army at age 15, but cannot drink, or they cannot be allowed to drive. These dissonances are very, very hard to deal with. And this is what makes certain governments, for example, consider them in one way or another either as problems or beneficiaries. So we need to figure out a way, not so much to put a time and say what 12 or 13 or whatever you become, because these have implications. For example, and I go back to the issue of women. For women, it's very, very critical that we figure out what it is that the age of the youth is, because it determines if your country or your village is going to allow you to be married at that age. And this is very, very key. Perhaps for young men, it may not be the same, but for young women, it's critical that you as an organization that speaks for the youth or works with the youth, be able to define that, because it's very, very critical, especially for young women, for the amount of time that their parents would be allowing them to be out there working in the community, in the front lines of their community. It's key. Will they say, you're too old to be out there? You're too old, you should be married by now. And that's going to go in their head. So that's on the entry point. At the exit point, we need to know what we're talking about so we can hold these governments accountable if they're not creating the right jobs for the right times. So for example, if governments are saying that you will only apply for a job if you are under 25 or you're 35, we know this especially in many scholarships, where they say you cannot apply for a job if you've passed the certain age of this or that. That means that if you've had children, or you are a little bit late. So who defines what the age is really has a lot of power, and I think it's the kind of discussions that we should at least be able to have without just seeing it as a scholarly amusement.
Great.
Thank you.
We are running late, but I hope we can have 10 minutes of conversation. So people who would like to ask, I think that's really good that we've had some real powerful thinking and powerful feelings about this. So let's get you in and see both what you think. You don't have to ask a question, you can just say what you think as well. Yeah, one there and one up there.
Hi, and thanks for your vision. I remain a cynic. Much as I appreciate what you're trying to do, it's taken a century just for the equality and gender debate, the glass ceiling to be broached now. And I do not see the men and the generation that holds power today is going to allow what you see to happen as fast as people would like to. How many leaders in the world are young? Maybe Trudeau, Macron. The rest of the world is still led by very old people. So for me, the opportunity of a generation is not just peak youth, but peak age. And you need to utilize that. If more and more governments are putting people out of work, you have a huge reservoir of people who can work together. So the question of development, we've talked about development in the UN and everything that has worked and hasn't worked. And that is what the crux is, to change that dialogue, that paradigm. Thank you.
Okay. And second one here, and I'm going to take a third one and then give you, when we've got three sort of there.
This is more of a comment, but I think it links into what Alice spoke about and part of what you spoke about, Perry, in particular. Nobody's mentioned here anything to do with the cultural nuances that will affect youth, the cultural nuances that affect that ability to go up the ladder of participation, as you called it. What are those components? And bearing in mind where the growth is coming from, it's North and West Africa. It's a completely different animal to Southern Africa, which is where I'm from. But Northern and West Africa are different. There is a perception that Northern Africans are not Africans. They don't consider themselves to be Africans because of their cultural backgrounds. West Africa is a very, very different animal, and yet nobody is talking about it. We're not discussing it, and the implications of what it does to women, their ability to seek education, and all of the different elements that we've spoken about. So I think it's something that needs to be discussed. I don't know if there'll be time, but it was just a concern for us to think about.
Well, no, just hang on. Let me take. Are there any students, first of all, who would like to come in on this? Great, go on. There you go. So, was there any in the middle there as well? No.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much for your talk and for all of your insights on that. Just, I suppose, partly a question and partly just a topic for consideration. So I suppose I'm a young person in the UK, and I very much hold youth empowerment as a value, and I'm very much the mindset that kind of, if you're good enough, you're old enough. There shouldn't be any kind of age limit on those things. But equally, I'm aware, particularly having spent some time not in Western countries, that's not something that's necessarily universally shared. I was at an interesting talk with someone who works for a fairly major NGO, and they'd worked with the community in Sudan to build a well, and they'd worked very nicely with that community, and very much had been kind of involving different stakeholders from different sectors of the community at different stages, and then they opened the well, and they didn't think to consult anyone at this stage, and they, without thinking, said, well, the children come first, and no one in the community would use the well after that, because in that community, it's the voice of the elders that are the most significant. And so it's how you reconcile what is perhaps held as accepted and normal in that community with what is arguably not necessarily a universal idea that young people can and should be leaders.
Yeah, actually that's very good, because that's a bit common. There's some commonalities about culture and everything. And I'll let any of you have a go. Perry, do you want to start?
Happy to. No, I was thinking, yeah, there's a trend across all three of those questions, and I mean, and forgive me if I came on too strong there.
No, we like it.
we do too. That's what we're all about. probably in that kind of approach, you'll find that this is a fight. Let me make no mistake about this. 15 years ago, it was very difficult to get young people into the room to influence decisions. I worked in Uganda for several years, and they were writing a national development plan. And this was a kind of an economic development plan with a view to kind of, as it says, 5 years of development, right? And this is where all the government monies were going to be directed, and we're going to turn around to all the donor governments and say invest into the areas of this plan, right? Which is it's a good thing, a national owning direction. And they ran something like 70 consultations. Minerals, tourism, women, people living with HIV, etc. Nothing on youth. That was the case 15 years ago, and we spent months banging on doors and getting chucked out of ministries, quite literally, until we finally got into somebody and said, yeah, we're happy to run a youth consultation, right? And young people put in their kind of recommendations and policies, and half of them got put into the National Development Plan, so it's good story, right? That was the case 15 years ago. The difference now, and it's not to say decision makers are ready to cede power to youth. Many are not, and many will hold on to it as long as they can. I totally take your point on that. The difference is the size of the population is so large that you would have to be basically negligent as a decision maker not to understand that. And so the kind of commonality across that is that we have tons of demand. We can't meet the demand from governments right now for us to advise them on how to engage young people. And that's not just northern governments. The northern governments tend to pay us. And by northern I mean US, UK, TANITA, Comic Relief, UN. There's big demand amongst decision makers for approaches. Now, the challenge, so your kind of question is how deep does that run? And what we found is we'll have one kind of politician buy it and go off and create a youth department, create a youth fund, change the whole direction of theirs. The next election, that gets pushed out. That's where we're at, and we're early stages of this kind of fight. And so I think your point on, if we haven't achieved on gender, why is it going to happen on youth? Too right, it's going to take some time. But I don't think it, kind of throws in disrepute the approach. So the kind of question about the well building, it's a classic development story right there. And so the question of kind of cultural nuance, this is where, the basic answer is not rocket science. It's ask young people. In the same way that, when we talk to people about meaningful youth engagement, all we're saying is not hand it all over to young people. Now, I've given you the extreme stories. The Ebola story is a good one. We lead with it a lot because there aren't many stories like it. You reference Parkland, all these kind of areas. The commonality and what we would tend to advise governments and communities is you've got this population. Simply bring them into the decision-making room. And whether or not that's in kind of, if you think about your program cycle of kind of needs identification, this is for development folks, needs, prioritization, program design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, feedback, redesign, right? Young people, 15 years ago, were never included in any of that. And all we're saying is bring them in there. And what you're bringing is a massive amount of insight about the most nuanced kind of things, of how things vary, not just from region of Africa to region, but within community to community. One of the most interesting things that we were part of in the last 10 years was a piece of research in Karamoja. So Karamoja is the extreme kind of northeast region of Uganda, bordering with the two other countries right there. And you have kind of what had previously been nomadic populations moving with cattle. That's the historical kind of nature. And oftentimes kind of cross-clan raiding was involved with guns and all this kind of stuff. And that was culturally how young men kind of came of age, right? And the development community came in, and the Ugandan government came in and sedentarized those populations. And they said, stop moving and start growing, right? And they took the cattle away, and they basically took away the agency of all the young people. And so when we opened work in Karamoja, I went and met with the head of the World Food Program. And he said, did you know we've been working there for 70 years? Can you imagine what would have happened if we hadn't been? And I bit my tongue. Because if they hadn't been handing out food off the back of trucks for 70 years, I can tell you what the outcome would have been. So it's a really fraught area, and a ton of development money going in there and getting very little yield. We asked young people to tell us why. And what they did is they set up their own kind of research methodology. Now this goes to the whole point. We're inundated with demand when these kind of areas come up. We ask young people to kind of participate. They come out in spades. And what they found is they said, look, livelihoods programming is not what you think it is. It's not about income. It's not about job. It's about three things. It's about creativity, resilience, and I forget the third one. And what they did is they took that policy document and shoved it down the throats of decision makers in Kampala and changed the way development money flew into that kind of region. Now, it's not all fixed, but it has helped, and they've since set up their own kind of spin-off of youth-led research in Karamoja. And it points to the solution here, which is not that young people are a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to change everything. We're certainly not trying to say that. The level of nuance, community to community, culture to culture, is incredibly different. Any external actor, and by external, I don't just mean a white guy from America or a decision maker in London. I mean decision maker in Kampala. I mean decision maker in Dar. Those people are as distant from the problem in many cases as are we. Young people offer a scalable way to bring in voice from the ground to make sure that well problem doesn't go wrong, et cetera. The decision makers can be brought on board. Yep. And I think that's it.
I'm going to stop you.
Yeah,
I'm going to stop you. No, I'm only just worried about anybody getting...
Yeah.
No, that's great. No, that was just a good point. I am going to just take the last two comments from Alia and from Alice. So, and then we are going to have to draw it to close. Do you want to have your go at that, whatever you like?
Yeah. So whenever I think of development, and especially work with youth, what I think about are the girls that I usually work with, the most underprivileged, who are literally invisible. So I usually think about the voices of those girls and how that can be brought forward, because unlike Ava, they don't know how to write. They hardly are able to go to school, and on top of that, they have a lot of power structures they have to deal with just to claim their basic rights. So usually my question is then, when we talk about youth, because I work with mothers, these were young. These were 19-year-olds when they were mothers, and now they are like 40 or something in the Middle Ages. They have young daughters now. But it's very difficult, and like you said, it's a very complicated sort of a thing, trying to bring their voices out as well. So that I think is a concern. But I think it's, I don't know, in terms of scalability, I don't know if that is possible. But then how do we learn from like those grassroots? How do we learn from their movements? Not putting the pressure on them, but rather trying to encourage them to be able to reach somewhere. Like that sort of attitude. This is the question in education that we raise. What is it that you expect of education? And what is it that it should give the people? Is it just the numbers, the letters, or is it like something else, agency? But how do you define that? So we're struggling a lot in trying to define what education should do, and whether or not there should be a globalized measure of outcomes, educational outcomes. Because with these skills, can these people survive in their particular environments? So it's a very complicated, messy kind of situation. But I always feel that those who are the most disadvantaged, these are the invisible people, and how do we bring their voices out?
Great. Alice, last word?
Yeah, I will say a few things. One is, I think one of the things that I see missing in most of development approaches is something that has to do with political participation. Almost all of these discussions seem to see young people as, yes, they have agency, but somehow this agency happens either alongside or a bit farther removed from the political processes in their countries. And I want to agree with your point, sir, because I think there is something here. We need to be able to make young people either care about politics enough to enter it or care about politics enough to change it. And it's if we don't, I mean, that's where the real power is. It doesn't really matter how we want to see it, but they really have to figure out how to own that kind of power, access to the resources of their own countries, and manage them. So if it means figuring out how to learn to run leadership campaigns, how to be a politician. I would love to see campaigns in the Global South that teach young women how to be a politician, how you speak to people, how do you go from activism issues to actually making a political case. So these things, I really hope that we can see them. And then the second point is something I want to say about the broader development industry. On this issue of the youth. This is my last point. I think we have to figure out a way not to go into the other patterns that we have had where we speak of buzzwords as empowerment, as this, as that. People build jobs around these things in the Western world. They create a narrative, but we don't really see real change on the ground. So the industry, the aid industry has to be able to step aside from these big, big terms and actually show real change. Otherwise, people will be, even the youth will be disillusioned, and we will just stay in the same circle over and over and over. So I hope this won't be another, empowerment terms or other development buzzwords. I hope that it really is going to be self-reflection, and it will be inclusive enough to actually involve young people from our home countries and not just, big meetings in New York and in London.
Great, thank you. Well, fantastic evening. Lots of good thoughts about that. Complex, no easy solutions, but lots of stuff about power, agency, but most importantly about inclusivity, I think, in all of that, whichever way we can make it happen. Let's go get a drink. There's drinks outside for everybody. Thank you. Let's give them a big round.